The radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody. Welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this Monday, November 4th. November 4th. God, that is a big day. Just some nostalgia. So November 4th, 1979 was my first day in the Israeli army. And November 4th, 1979, same day, was the day the hostages got taken in the Iranian embassy. Right. And today, it's the day before the election, but we're not going to talk elections today. We're going to, we've talked enough about elections. You're probably sick about them anyway. We are going to talk philosophy of science and private space exploration. So I've got Mike Mazza here with me. Mike is a associate fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute, a teacher at the Ayn Rand University, a lecturer, writer who does research on the philosophy of science. And so, Mike, thanks for joining me tonight.
Thanks for having me, Yaron.
So probably the most, maybe the most important thinker in the 20th century regarding philosophy of science, maybe not the most important, but most influential thinker is Karl Popper, at least on certain fields. So maybe tell us a little bit about who Karl Popper was, and we can talk about some of his influence.
Yeah, Karl Popper was an Austrian philosopher of science. He was associated with, but not part of, the Vienna Circle, which is the kind of philosophical circle in the 20s and 30s in Vienna that gave birth to logical positivism, logical empiricism, if you've heard those terms before.
In a sense, is what
so it's a form of experience first philosophy that couples a sense data view of perception. So this idea that sense perception is given to us as atomic units. Blue here now is what you get from perception. Kind of couples that way of thinking with the new logic that was being developed in the early 20th century. So this kind of crowd has a circle in Vienna that Popper visited occasionally, and Wittgenstein is another important 20th century philosopher who was going to these meetings in Vienna. Anyway, Popper wasn't a logical positivist. He saw himself as being one of their harsh critics, offering an alternative. He winds up at the London School of Economics eventually. Mm-hmm. He was friends with Friedrich Hayek, the Austrian economist, and eventually he's in the United States as well. But one of the reasons I'm teaching a class on Karl Popper currently for ARU is not just his influence as a philosopher of science, but he has a whole system of thought where he's interested in offering a theory of rationality is the way I think about it. And has a pretty wide-ranging influence on people, not just in the sciences, but in thinking about politics. His book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, is a defense of a free society. Very interesting read. He's one of the few thinkers in the 20th century, other than Ayn Rand, to put the major issues of the 20th century in terms of individualism versus collectivism, and he's squarely on the individualist side. Mm-hmm. But that book is influential on libertarian types, some kind of moderate right types, but also at the same time on some progressive figures. So that George Soros's Open Society is named after that book. So.
How does that make it? How do you make sense of that fact?
Well, the kind of older non-Marxist leftists see themselves as liberals, mm-hmm. as being in favor of democratic open societies, democratic socialism, so-called. They don't see themselves as being authoritarian or in favor of one-party rule. And and often they see themselves as being opponents to that. They're anti-fascist, right? So, and I guess that's where the common cause is, post-war liberalism.
So, who are some of or what are the areas in which he has had the most profound impact or the most influence? I mean, I know from economics, maybe the most important essay that Milton Friedman wrote, or the one that he wrote about methodology, is purely Popperian, and that is considered one of the peaks of Milton Friedman's career.
Yeah, well, we should get into eventually some of the details of what is and isn't Popperian. So my recollection of that essay is that it's in certain respects Popper would
Okay.
if I recall, it's Friedman saying that what matters is whether or not your postulates are come out passing tests. You can
Whether your theory has predictive power or not.
yeah, has predictive power. Yeah,
Yep.
so that much. But Popper's a realist. He thinks scientific theories are approximations to the truth. So he thinks there's more to that,
Okay.
more to science than just that, it makes the right predictions or some people have a view that science is like not true or false. It's like a tool. And that's not Popper. Popper thinks scientific theories are false and approximating to the truth.
So who are some of the other people that he would have influenced, and how influential is he today within the realm of science?
Yeah, so in philosophy of science, he's not influential, or he's not anymore. Like if you're talking about academic philosopher people in the universities, his heyday, I think, would be maybe the 30s through the 60s in philosophy of science. So there's a line of influence from Popper to two people that are a little more obscure, Feyerabend and Lakatos, are two mid-20th century philosophers of science. Actually, Feyerabend might be a familiar name to some people in the audience because Rand criticizes him by name in the essay, I think it's From the Horse's Mouth, in the book Philosophy Who Needs It. And there's amusing correspondence between Feyerabend and some other people where he praises Rand for having the best invective. So there's a little Popper, twice removed Popper tie-in. So he's influential on them. The figure that most of your audience would be most likely to have heard of is Thomas Kuhn, who's writing in the 60s, I think. So there's a kind of line of influence through these figures to a sort of skepticism about science, which Popper himself did not appreciate. He thinks of himself again as a realist. Scientific theories are, you can judge one is better than the other, one is more true than the other, than another. Now you can never really get to a perfectly true theory. You can only get closer to the truth. So there's that line of influence. But I think his biggest line of influence is outside of academic philosophy, and on scientists themselves. So I've seen this both in practice from practicing scientists and from sort of pop science communicators like Bill Nye the Science Guy and Neil deGrasse Tyson, those types. Also, I've seen it come up in literary depictions of science. So if you ask a practicing scientist who's not like actively interested in philosophy of science, they'll probably give you some picture of what they're doing as like, well, we have sort of background beliefs about the reproduction of bacteria or something, and we have some new hypotheses, and what we're concerned with isn't so much where we get these new what we want to do is put them to a rigorous test, and if they pass if our new hypothesis passes a rigorous test, we're not certain that it's true. We're not under any delusions that we have some kind of deep insight into the nature of reality, but we do know that it's not been refuted yet, and we keep going through this process of subjecting our hypotheses, our scientific speculations to testing, and through time we get kind of the image sort of resolves, but never gets to perfect resolution. And you also kind of see this idea come up in defenses of science. Like if you think of maybe what was this, 15 years ago was the last time we had a big wave of creationism and controversy in the schools. So, creation theory isn't falsifiable. That is, you could not do a test that would refute it. And that's a kind of simplistic Popperian idea that what distinguishes science is that you can subject your theories to a test that would refute them. So that's a lot of the influence it's had, like how people think about science. And now I said that's a kind of naive or simplistic version of Popper, but it's accurate, even simplified to Popper. So another way in which Popper's had a lot of influences to people's thinking about being rational or objective. I think I see a big Popperian influence in the so-called rationalist community. Slate Star Codex, the blog, I think he renamed it Astral Codex 10. The author is Scott Alexander.
Yep.
It's a popular blog. There's a group blog that Scott Alexander helped found, which is called Less Wrong. That's was in its heyday, widely read in the kind of tech sphere. And just the title of that blog, Less Wrong, is very Popperian. So you subject your beliefs to tests and you get less wrong with time. Not that you get to the truth, that you get right, but you get less wrong. And then, like I mentioned earlier, there's the kind of political influence, which is that one for me is harder to track who and how much the influence is. But
yeah, I mean, I find it very influential. Again, I don't know if accurately influential because I don't know Popper well enough, but the libertarians talk about him all the time, primarily through Hayek, I think.
yeah, probably
The influence of Hayek. They both were at LSC, I think, at about the same time, and
they were friends and they dedicated books to each other. So yeah.
And then, and I think that there's a lot of people in the Hayek tradition among libertarians harken back to Popper. Yeah. So what is your estimation about how interesting or original or important he is as a philosopher in the context of kind of the history of the philosophy of science or the history of philosophy, or certainly over the last couple of 100 years?
I find him a really interesting figure if you move beyond what you'd get in like an intro to philosophy of science class. So I used to know Popper as this sort of falsificationist thing that everybody learns in undergraduate if you take a philosophy of science class. But a couple years ago, I started to look at him, more just what other things had he written on, and I was surprised at the breadth of subjects he had something interesting to say on. So just we're not so I mentioned I'm teaching a class on him. So let me give you two things. So one is he has a view that there is a common thread amongst rationalist and empiricist philosophers of the Enlightenment. And he talks about them as having secularized important religious errors, ERROR, errors, which sounds a lot like the kind of thing Ayn Rand would say. And now we can talk more about what exactly that view of his is, but just that he's kind of thinking broadly about the influence ideas have on history and on, this is how he traces back the rise of authoritarianism in the West. It's these errors, the Bacon, Descartes, the early Enlightenment figures were really great and revolutionary in that they wanted to hold down the authority of the church and give autonomy to individuals to decide themselves. But he thinks they replaced the kind of authority of God or the ancients with two other false idols, the authority of your senses or the authority of your reason. And he thinks that relying on your senses or your reason as an infallible source of knowledge is just the same mistake as relying on religious revelation. So I think that's a really interesting kind of Um, I think the other I had in mind that I'm not covering in my Popper class is nonetheless very interesting is his defense of free will. He has an argument that determinism is self-contradictory, which is very few people like Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden make that argument in the old Objectivist newsletter.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot of people in the history of philosophy who've done that. There's Popper, there's Kant, and I think the next figure that I know of is Epicurus, maybe. I might be mistaken. It's one of the ancient philosophers. I might be misremembering which one. So that's another kind of point of contrast with Rand. But he's interesting to me because I think of him as a systematic thinker who's not as original or powerful, nowhere near as original or powerful as a Plato or a Rand or an Aristotle, and not as powerful like as a Descartes, but original and systematic enough that he really stands out in the 20th century, where you don't really get those kind of people at all. And especially that he's working in academic analytic departments where they're like against that kind of way of doing philosophy. And Popper's somebody who thinks, no, ideas matter and they change the way the world evolves, and like they have life and death consequences. And when you get into his political thinking, it's all of the stuff from his epistemology is there. Like, here's how wrong views of essences made people adopt Marxist views of history, and how that led to this and that. So there's a lot to especially if you like ideas. Just generally, you're interested in ideas and the impact they have on history. Just to see somebody else coming from it, as an objectivist, somebody coming from like a completely different perspective. Raising some of the same questions, and a rough contemporary of Rand. Popper died in the 90s, I think.
Does he have a moral theory and ethics?
So I should say I'm not a Popper expert, certainly not a Popper scholar. I have a couple books on Popper, like secondary books, What's Popper About? And none of them really talk about any moral theories that he had. I would imagine he's a moral skeptic, but I just don't know. Yeah. I mean, there's certainly moral elements to his defense of individualism, and he thinks it's superior to collectivism. So there's the kind of social, if you want to think of it, social morals are there. In that he's a proponent of individualism. But if you think, like, does he have a view of virtue, or does he think there's objective moral values? I could see a case for either way. But I mean, none of the anthologies I have, or that I have this is kind of my favorite Popper book, Conjectures and Refutations. There's really not much of anything about morals.
Okay, so at the heart of it seems like the heart of Popper is epistemology. I mean, he sees epistemology in politics. So how does he approach the field? I mean, you said he rejects God and authority that it's external to you, but he also rejects the authority in a sense of reason and the senses. So what's left, right? What is there?
Yeah, so he endorses a view that's sometimes called fallibilism, which is that there is no infallible source of information or knowledge about the world. So objectivism would be I think you could raise a question of whether or not this is the right way to make your categories. But if you were to momentarily accept the categories of fallibilism versus infallibilism, Rand would be an infallible. So the senses are an infallible source of information. Now, she has a very different view of what that means than the empiricists, who also, in a certain respect, thinks your senses are, if you hear red now is a kind of sense information you might get, which is that there is a red patch in front of you at this moment is not something you could be wrong about. So in that sense, that's infallible. Infallibilist, rationalists are infallible. So if it a priori, I think therefore I am, or I exist as a thinking thing from Descartes, like, you can't be wrong about that. So long as you understand what that means, you can't be wrong about it. And Popper thinks, no, every proposition you could entertain in your mind could be could be mistaken. So that's
But
one.
metaphysically, there is a truth. There is reality.
Yeah, this is a question that I think how can Popper maintain that given the other things he believes? But that is one of his convictions, that there is that we do have knowledge, that scientific theories they're not exactly true, they're closer to the truth. So he has a technical concept he calls verisimilitude, which if you like break down the roots, vera being coming from truth, and then the similitude is like so it means like truth-like or truth-likeness. And he has, if you really get into the Popper weeds, there's like technical definitions of this where he tries to quantify how truth-like one theory is versus another by comparing the number of falsified propositions in one or the other. So you could like really get into this, but I think the two points that are most important for Popper are the fallibilism, and then if there's a name for this one, he doesn't think that knowledge has justification in its favor or proof, or confirmation. So he thinks that idea that when you entertain a proposition, you have to establish that it is true with the evidence. He thinks that is one of these religious errors. Really, what you do when you're entertaining a hypothesis is evidence is relevant in that you subject it to criticism. That is, you have Yaron and I will talk for 2 hours. Is my hypothesis? What would falsify that? Well, we just see what time the call ends, and that's okay. If it's 2 hours, then the hypothesis passed the test. If not, then it fails. There's only like trying to falsify or trying to refute. That's what epistemology is about. It's not about going from the ground up and proving something. So those are the two kind of pillars of Popper's thinking. There's no inductive proof. There's no confirmation. There's no support for what you believe. There's only criticism, and that every source of knowledge or belief is fallible.
So how would you relate that, or how would you compare that to Rand's view, epistemological view, and for both, say something about induction and how that plays a role?
Yeah, so Popper thinks two things. So one is induction is not a valid source of knowledge. But he also thinks, and this is a little different, that no one ever actually thinks inductively either. So other inductive skeptics would say, yeah, I mean, you do this all the time, don't you? You see one white swan, another white swan, another white swan, and you generalize it. So, no, that's not really what we do. It's not just that that's invalid. We don't even do that, is Popper's view. What we do is we kind of have a hypothesis maybe suggested to us by our experience or by testimony from other people. You see a couple of swans and you hypothesize, oh, maybe swans are white. And then what you actually do is hold on to that until you can subject it to criticism. So I saw a bunch of white swans. I haven't seen any non-white swans. So I hold this hypothesis in my mind. And if I'm really like actively thinking about this for some reason, what I would do is try to find a non-white one. And so there's no generalization really. There's just suggestion of a speculation or a conjecture. So he's an anti-inductivist. There's no inductive generalizing. It's not something we do psychologically. And even if we did do it, it's not a valid form of reasoning. Now that's in contrast with Rand, who's, a champion of induction, of the inductive method. You get this from her writing, and you get it even more if you're learning objectivism from Leonard Peikoff. He really hammers this home, especially hard, that the way to know anything is ultimately through some kind of inductive process that starts with sense perception, and then details need to be filled in, but you go from sense perception up to your most abstract idea. It's all rooted in sense perception and proved or validated by a process of induction. So yeah, we would definitely be in the bad camp according to Popper. Objectivists would. So how do these two relate? Well, I mean, they're about as unless you want to include skepticism in here, they're about as far apart as you can get. So for Popper, there's no proof, there's no certainty in science, there's no induction, there's only, he has the view that it sort of doesn't matter where you get your hypotheses from.
Mhm.
So to him, there's just sort of two different questions. There's like, where did my hypothesis come? And then what do I do with it epistemologically? And where you get your hypothesis from is psychology, biography. It's not epistemology.
But is where you get the hypothesis from, is it intrinsic in some way? That is, are the hypotheses there inside your mind to be discovered?
No. So
So it's not Plato in that sense.
no. So he thinks Plato's a villain to him.
Yep.
Plato's a bad guy.
Yep.
Plato gets certain things right, but Plato's a villain. No, so there's not one place your hypotheses come from. So the first essay of his we read in my class is called On the Sources of Knowledge and Ignorance. And he says the idea that there is a source of knowledge is a mistake. There are many sources of many fallible sources of knowledge. So yeah, you might, observe a little bit of a pattern in nature and that suggests something to you. That's not an induction. That's just a suggestion. And any more than it's not an induction if your mom says all swans are white. It's just gave you this idea. And where does it come from? It doesn't matter where it comes from. What matters is what you do with it once you have it. Do you subject it to the appropriate critical tests? And if you do subject it to the appropriate critical tests, then it counts as knowledge in your mind. And I mean, if it passes the test, if it fails the test, then you reject it and you falsify it. There's a history of kind of severing the discovery, the scientific discovery from scientific proof or justification. And Popper's definitely on the side of keeping these two separate. There's questions about epistemology, and then there's questions about discovery, which are psychological, historical, not philosophical.
So David asked a question this afternoon. She says his falsification theory seems to be the most accepted idea in demarcation of what is and is not science or the scientific method. How could Rand or how could we be opposed to that?
Well, so one is it's what are you demarcating from? So Popper's in different way interested in different things, several different things. How do you distinguish science from pseudoscience, or like a so-called conspiracy theory or something? And then how do you distinguish or demarcate science from other, like philosophy or metaphysics or something? Now, for him, the answer is all, there's falsification plays a role. For Rand, I think that those are just different. You wouldn't try to give a unified demarcation of science from non-science, because that could be all kind of things. Like what makes science different from philosophy is different from what makes science different from like astrology. So that's one thing to say. So for Rand, what's going to distinguish science from something like astrology is the very thing Popper says is impossible, which is, well, you need to have positive evidence in favor of your view, of your hypothesis, of your theory, in order for it to be epistemologically, legitimate to entertain. And Darwin's theory of evolution, for example, has loads of positive evidence in its favor, and creation science has none. So creation science is not really a science, its name notwithstanding. And what's the positive evidence that what astrological sign you're born under influences like whether or not you'll get a new job this week? There's zero. So the way she'll demarcate, or she doesn't really write about this, but the way I assume she would, if she were to take this up, would be to just say, it's really the difference between the possible and the arbitrary. So pseudoscience is a kind of dressed up, elaborate arbitrary speculation, whereas science is then now there's the question of science versus rational non-science is a different question. But just there between science and pseudoscience would be, I think, about evidence and arbitrariness.
Mhm.
Now, one of the features of a good hypothesis that has evidence in its favor is that you can ask yourself the question, what could I learn that would cut against this or disprove it? And I mean, if you just, this is why I think Popper has a lot of cachet amongst scientific people who think scientifically, is that it captures something right about good thinking. It's, yeah, I have this view that the SpaceX Starship will bring more mass to orbit than any other starship or any other spaceship, and you say, okay, well, I have positive evidence in that favor. They caught the thing, and it's et cetera, et cetera. What would convince me otherwise? Well, okay, the real test is when it goes on the market. So if they start, trying to sell launch capabilities, and they can't find any customers, and the whole thing's a giant financial boondoggle, then that would falsify and I could think ahead of time, like, okay, so I tell myself, once I get that information, I'll update my belief accordingly. And you could think about that as like, yeah, that could falsify what I believe. And that it's important to do that kind of thinking. I mean, you should always be thinking like, okay, what could I learn that might cut against my current hypothesis? That's just good, being objective. I think there was more to the question that I haven't answered.
I mean, really, what is it about falsificationism would Rand oppose? That is, to what extent would Rand be against it as a theory of knowledge?
Well, if you want to put the ism on it, where you're not just talking in the simplified way, like this test is going to, refute my hypothesis. If you want to put the ism on, part of the falsification ism is that you can never establish that a theory is correct.
Mm-hmm.
You don't ever get supporting evidence. Evidence is only critical or refuting. So that's, I mean, on its own, that's a major difference between not just Rand, but most people who are in the pro-science category. Yeah, you can get evidence in favor of a theory, and there's something maybe somebody won't want to go in with for proof, but there's something like support or more probable. So if you've ever heard the idea that, well, evidence raises the probability of your hypothesis.
Yep.
This is kind of sometimes called Bayesian philosophy or Bayesian induction. Popper's against that too. So, this way of thinking, say, okay, my hypothesis before I do my experiment is that I think it's 60% likely. I do my experiment, I update my hypothesis. Now I think it's 90% likely. You might have somebody say, yeah, it can keep going like this. You never get to 100, which would be like certainty, but you can, get closer to certainty. And that's, there's actually something called the Popper-Miller theorem that they proved in probability theory to try to show you can't do this. Like, Popper is very much opposed to any idea of supporting evidence that supports a claim. It's only conflicting, only evidence that would refute, or that it's built into the name, falsify the hypothesis.
And why is that? What is it against the positive that he's fighting against? What is it that he?
Yeah, so it's the anti-inductionism or the anti-justificationism that it's not like you can do it but never get there. It's that that's just not what we do in thinking rationally. Is you just have hypotheses. It does just, or conjecture, like the name of his book is Conjectures and Refutations. You just have a conjecture.
Mm-hmm.
And your conjectures presumably should be consistent with previous conjectures you've had that are not falsified, but you're never going to prove or justify or give supporting evidence in favor. What you can do is give evidence that it's false. This is incidentally like a major thing that comes up when you read debates about particle physics and string theory. It's like, can you falsify this? And what the idea of that is like, well, there's some prediction from string theory that there's this particle, and we'd need some super particle accelerator the size of the solar system to test it. So does that mean it's science because you can't really do it? And you really get Popperian type debates about this, about, yeah, if you can't test this string theory, then it's not science, it's metaphysics or it's philosophy. And that's all Popperian terms. It's about make a prediction that we can check, and if the prediction fails, we say, okay, that was a wrong theory.
So how does his idea that knowledge is fallible, right, that there's no certainty, fit with Rand's notion of truth as contextual?
That's a good question. So Popper does think that theories are true or approximate the truth. Sorry, he thinks not that they're true, that they approximate the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And the conception of truth he has is a kind of so-called correspondence view. It's like, does your theory line up with the facts of reality? That kind of view. So at least on the surface, he has a similar view of truth to Rand. And I think really actually he doesn't, but that's because I don't think she says she's a correspondence theorist. I don't think she is. So that's a kind of tangent. But no, so what she means by truth is contextual, is that it's the context of your hypothesis or of your theory that tells you what the actual meaning and content of the theory is. So you can't really say, if you take the example from Dr. Peikoff's OPAR, Objectivism and the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, the book, he gives this example of the discovery of the different types of blood, the AB, ABO, and then the RH factor, the positive or negative. And if you think about what it means to say that it's true that A blood types are compatible, the idea is that part of what that means is the evidentiary context within which somebody arrived at that conclusion. So when I say that A and B or A types are compatible, what I'm doing is pointing to a certain type of blood, and I'm not making any claims about whether there are additional factors that might be relevant. So I don't. So how does Yaron, was your question? How does falsification?
How do you pronounce it? The idea that it's all fallible.
Fallibilism. Yeah.
Fallibilism. We're constantly approaching the truth, but we can never.
Okay, so that's
related to knowledge is contextual in the sense that
that's different from the fallibilism. So
it is different.
The fallibilism is just that there's no source of knowledge or conjecture that's infallible. They're all error prone. I think the word you're searching for is verisimilitude, is the truth likeness.
We'll never make it into my vocabulary.
I know it probably shouldn't. It's a term you only need if you're interested in Popper and some of his critics. So the idea of truth likeness. No, I think it's just a different concept. It's for at least as far as I know, for Rand is going to say, no, truth is binary. Something's true or false. There's not, the idea of truth likeness, doesn't that push against the law of excluded middle, that something could be not quite true, not quite false? I don't see a relationship between that concept and the idea of contextual truth, because the context there is sort of conditioning what does the thing you're saying is true even mean? And what does it mean to say that A blood types are compatible? And that's what the context is doing. But whether or not they're compatible is that's either true or false. So that's No, I think that's a good question to ask, but I think they're just different, different issues.
So, why do you think Popper is a good foil to objectivism? Why is it worth studying Popper for objectivists? Do we gain more
Yeah.
clarity about objectivism by doing so?
So I think so for a number. So one is anytime you can like for any systematic thinker that you're trying to understand, putting them in setting them up against another one is just illuminating for both. So if you want to understand Plato better, you have to think about, okay, well, what would Aristotle say about this? Like that'll just help you. So Rand's no different. To think about Rand and objectivism, you'd want to, okay, so what would Kant say about this? I mean, she does it herself. Like, here's what Kant said, here's why I'm anti-Kantian, and here's Plato. And so just because she only talked about Plato, Aristotle, and Kant at any length, doesn't mean we can't put her in dialogue with someone else. So that's just the generic point. The other is, I said earlier, there's not a lot of systematic thinkers who are grappling with 20th century, big picture 20th century issues, specifically the rise of communism and Marxism and more broadly totalitarianism. So he's one of the few along with Rand. So there's a valid or a fruitful point of comparison there. Also because he's in certain ways and in certain moods, it's really striking that the way in which he's thinking about these questions are similar to Rand's. Like he says and he uses the terms individualism versus collectivism. And it's like I used to, when I was new to objectivism, nobody else talks this way. Like who says it's occasionally like I'd hear some conservative do, but then they'd say I got this from Atlas Shrugged. Yeah. So that there's somebody else thinking in those terms is, I think, are they really on the same, coming from the same place, or are they arriving at some similar position from different arguments? Are these arguments complementary or inconsistent? Like those are interesting questions to ask about Rand. The other another point on this is just that he's interested in not just, here's why, this is more like a Hayek, here's why totalitarianism or socialism won't work, or why there's a calculation problem, that, markets work, and you destroy the markets, you won't have certain information, so you can't be productive. It's like, how did we get here? Like the line was away from authoritarianism towards individual freedom for a long time, and then it seemed like we did a complete 180 somewhere around 1925 or whatever, pick your year. How did we get to that place? And his diagnosis of that is deep philosophical rot that goes back to the origins of the Enlightenment. And just at that level of description, Rand says the same thing. Now, again, it's coming from, I think of Popper as there's a phrase I got from, I think it's from Leonard Peikoff's dim hypothesis that I like. He calls them knowing skeptics.
Mm-hmm.
I think that really describes Popper. Like, he does not want to be a skeptic. He'll tell you he's not a skeptic, but he doesn't think scientific theories are true or can be proved. He likes science. He doesn't want to wind up in skepticism. I mean, the whole line of philosophy of science that happens in his wake that I mentioned, the people, Feyerabend, Lakatos, Kuhn, they're skeptics. They like science, but they're like, yeah, this is just, we can't say this is objectively true. It's just, useful, whatever. So he's a kind of pro-science, 20th century big picture thinker who asks interesting questions, has original answers, and has at a certain level of abstraction, very similar answers to Rand. Now, when you get into this, it's really, he's a kind of moderate Kantian about knowledge and philosophy. But at least my observation is that the only real philosophers for the last 150 years are Kantians anyway. So it's not kind of surprising. They're the only ones who are actually doing the subject philosophy as Rand would see it. Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on David Deutsch, who's, I guess, the modern or the current day proponent of Popperian philosophy and is supposedly taking it further? And what's his famous book?
So there's Conceiving Infinity, and then there's a more recent one. I have them on my
One I
bookshelf.
read.
Yeah, the Infinity one, and then there's another one 10 years later. And the name's escaping me. Maybe somebody in the YouTube chat.
Somebody will. Brett will give us a name in a minute.
Yeah. But I mean, so I consider myself, with all the usual qualifications, a Deutsch fan. I follow him on Twitter. I'm
Beginning
interested
of Infinity. So
the beginning of Infinity, and what's the other one?
Fabric of Reality.
Fabric of Reality. That's it.
I've
That's it.
read the beginning of Infinity,
Yeah.
and I'm a Deutsch fan with all the caveats at
Yeah.
line. I follow him on Twitter. He follows me, I think. So
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah. I mean,
we've
he's
communicated. We've exchanged positive things, positive communications.
I mean, he's really great on a lot of the recent political
He really is.
issues. Israel, free speech, I think, too, is something I've noticed him being better than average on. But just the whole moral tone he takes with Israel, I think, is, and he's anyone who has a pro-science attitude nowadays, and I cut them a lot of slack, maybe more than I should, but no, he says he's a Popperian. When I see him and when I hear him talk about it in interviews at any length and depth, it's more, I get the sense that it's more like Popper's a really important, influential figure on him that he wants to, frame everything he says in philosophy around, but that he's not really Popperian in the sense that maybe you or I would say were Randian or something. Like, it's just a really strong influence on him, but he's not bought into the whole Popper system. I'm thinking of a recent interview in which the interviewers were knowledgeable about Popper and pushing back on him, saying, no, Popper doesn't really think that way. And he was saying, yeah, well, I mean, I'm not, I don't see myself as carrying any Popper torch. It's just an influence on him. But no, I think one of the things I like about him is his emphasis on thinking about science as giving you potential explanations that you have to compare. And that's what science is all about, explanations. He frames that as being opposed to giving inductive generalizations. Like, those are two opposed things, inductive generalizations versus explanations. But no, I think there's a lot to like about him. But
I mean, I found the book infuriating in a sense because I'd read one chapter and it was like, this is amazing. He's so good. I agree with everything he wrote, which is almost, I mean, completely, never happens. And then the next chapter is like, what is he talking about? This is, and it just,
I mean, when he's in favor of
he's good. He's really good.
Yeah. But when he's bad, he's really bad. He's in favor of this multiverse thing and the many worlds, quantum mechanics stuff. I mean, it's other people you could have on to talk about that, but let's say I don't find it remotely plausibly true that those things are true. But I mean, he's done good work. My understanding is he's done really important work in the foundations of quantum computing and things like that. So I have a lot of respect for him with, like we were saying, the appropriate qualifications. So.
All right, let's do a big shift or somewhat of a shift. And we have a bunch of questions on Popper, so we'll get to those afterwards. But let's talk a little bit about space exploration. I know this is a passion of yours.
Yeah.
How did you get to this? I mean, you're doing philosophy of science, and then.
Well, it's philosophy of science and technology, so they're not exactly unrelated. But
No.
From one, like, how did I get to this? I mean, I went to space camp in 7th grade, so
Okay.
I've been kind of on this track for 20, 25, 30 years. So
Brett Hall says David Deutsch invented the theory of quantum computation.
yeah, I think
Pretty big deal. Yeah.
yeah, he's one of the founding figures in that. Yeah. Yeah, so a couple of things. So one is I'm writing on it, nothing being published anytime soon, maybe later in the year. But I'm interested in what's if you're a fan of the early space program, the Apollo program, and if you're a fan of mid 20th century, even later 20th century science fiction, so I check both those boxes. There's kind of this vision of the future that I don't know at the time, like I wasn't alive at the time, but like in 1970s seemed to a lot of people very possible and not too far away. Like the Wernher von Braun, who was the chief architect of the Apollo program, the Saturn rocket, had a whole Mars mission worked out, a Mars program that was going to be the next step, and like was taken seriously. And you can go look up nuclear pulse propulsion on all these elaborate rocketry, like the next stages of rocketry that were going to be explored, that just kind of never materialized. In 2001, A Space Odyssey has us going to Jupiter, manned mission to Jupiter in 2001. So like, that wasn't just fantasy at the time. There was reason to think, like, if you look at the beginning of NASA to the moon landing was like it's 11, 12 years, something like that. It wasn't that long of a time. So why do we stall out? And then is there any particular explanation for why it's picked up now? And I'm interested. There's a couple of things you might say. Well, one might just be, that all that mid 20th century stuff was just fantasy. We couldn't have done it then, even if we thought we could have. Maybe now technologically we can. I don't think that's the right explanation. But so I'm interested in answering that question, and I think there's a respect in which if the ambitions of people like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and then the less celebrity versions of this, the Rocket Labs, and there's a couple companies that are doing really interesting things besides SpaceX. If that materialized, I think that would be not just technologically, but like culturally an important turning point. So if you read what Rand said about the Apollo program, even though it's a government program, et cetera, but just the way in which that inspired the culture to reach for something higher and respect science. And I think you could get something similar out of a private space industry. So if the first people on Mars are from a private company, and like it's not only an amazing technological scientific achievement, but it's amazing industrial venture capital achievement. So there's just a lot of reasons to be interested in it, and to want to defend it and protect it from what will be inevitably be people's knives and resentments will come out against Musk's political activities are certainly kind of stirring the sand, and the monsters are coming out against him.
Yeah. So what do you make of, what do you think the status of the industry is today? Where are we on our mission to get to Mars or Jupiter or whatever, and to what extent is private space companies contributing to that?
Yeah. So the only game in town as far as potentially getting to Mars is SpaceX. NASA's moon missions are dependent on SpaceX and Blue Origin. The real test for all I'm a big SpaceX fan. I love the rocket catch and the Falcon 9 landings, but the real test for any of these technologies is bringing them to market. And right now, Starship is still a prototype, and Blue Origin's New Glenn rocket hasn't launched yet. But that said, it seems the only games in town are SpaceX and then Blue Origin a kind of distant second. And Musk says starships landing autonomously on Mars or launching in 2 years. That's consistent with NASA's demands on them, like contractual demands on them for the moon mission. So if they meet their obligations to NASA, they'll be doing refueling this summer, this coming summer, orbital refueling. Now it's, Musk has a lot of overpromising to answer for in his past, but his track record has been to be off, not to be wrong. So I'm optimistic. I don't really have any though insight into that the timeline stuff.
So what's your thoughts of Blue Origin? I mean,
I'll say though, Yaron, just as a context setting, I'm somewhat of a Mars skeptic. Now, as much as I think it would be incredible to see happen, and like I'm, I went to, like I said, I went to space camp, and it's so exciting. Like it was spelling out to myself, why even do this? Why not just send robot? Like, why do we need to colonize another? I come up short with good reasons. I mean,
particularly given when we're not having kids, right?
yeah, well, I mean, but Musk and it's not just him; it's the whole culture of SpaceX is this like pronatalism. Build a colony on this other planet to progress the species. No, I mean, my perspective is like the Starship stuff is really awesome if it works. The colonizing Mars, I think, like if I had to make a prediction, it would be Starship is great and colonizing Mars like bankrupt SpaceX. I don't see any reason to go there. Yeah, but the moon landing is coming up. They've got they've built out mock-up moon landers with crew quarters and everything. So it seems to be going behind schedule, but still progressing. That's what I can gather from what's in the press.
Yeah, I mean, Robert Heinlein had the idea that to preserve liberty and freedom, you had to keep pushing. That is, you had to keep finding new places where pioneers could go to. I mean,
that is the one. So if you said no, the reason to go to Mars is not to like, how does he say it? Move consciousness out into, it's something about preserving consciousness, some nonsense. But if it's no, we want to make possible more political migration. I mean, all the Earth is habitable. Okay, that might actually make some sense at some point. If there's new land to settle.
I mean,
but one of the things
that I think, right? They've just liberated Moon, and then he's on a spaceship the next place, right? It's like not good enough. Let's go next. So what's your sense of Blue Origin? It's another billionaire, another richest man in the world, and yet hasn't been that successful. Do you have any insight into what the differences are other than Elon?
Yes. So one is I'm definitely in the camp of thinking that SpaceX is successful because Musk has some kind of secret managerial engineering sauce that he's not sharing. But I mean, Blue Origin, if you think of Musk as driving SpaceX, and Jeff Bezos is certainly some kind of, once in 100-year industrial genius with Amazon. Sure. My understanding is that he wasn't very involved with Blue Origin. He founded it. He owned ownership stake, but in terms of managing it, it's been only very recently that he's kind of become more hands-on. He stepped down at Amazon as CEO, and he's become more involved with versus SpaceX, which has been Musk's baby since the beginning. Like there are whole books about the Falcon 9 program and like how obsessive he was with it, and like all the things he did to stop the company from going bankrupt. Like that's the contrast between the two, the two billionaires is easy to draw. So that's got to be part of the explanation. The other is I do think that the Mars goal explains a lot of decisions that SpaceX has made that seem to give them an advantage. Like the choices of what rocket fuel to use, like they chose one that could be manufactured on Mars from water and carbon dioxide, like which is slightly less efficient than, or not slightly, I think it's less efficient enough that it's a weird choice to make than hydrogen and combining hydrogen and oxygen for rocket fuel. So there's things like that I think are driving them. That if like the Bezos, the way he talks about it is he wants to do for space commercialization what the early internet companies did for to make possible all the e-commerce. And so his idea is if you get the mass to orbit down low enough, then you can start to see like dorm room space startups, right?
Yeah.
That's the Bezos kind of what drives him. You can see this in his interview with Lex Friedman. For Elon Musk, it's I want to get people on Mars. So okay, that's also a mass to orbit problem, but it's going to manifest itself in different ways. And there's a recent interview of Bezos where he talks about reusability, and he says the economics of first stage rocket reusability are clear. It's just better. It's but for second, multi-stage rockets, like do we need the additional stages to be reusable? He says it's not clear until you actually build it and start like experimenting on the market. Whereas for the SpaceX can't have that perspective because they want the second stage to be the Starship and they want it to land on the moon and Mars. So it's just different economics, and it's driving different decisions that you have to take them in the context of they're trying to accomplish different goals.
Yep.
I actually think that Blue Origin's goals are more exciting, whereas SpaceX has the more exciting technology.
Do you think Blue Origin? Do you think in the next few years we'll hear more about the achievements and successes?
Well, the New Glenn is their big product, and they're supposed to launch it the first time. I think they're a couple months behind schedule, so it should launch, I've heard, by the end of the year. Yeah. Now, someone in the industry told me they don't expect it to go well, but they're at a competitor, so who knows? But I mean, if it goes well, then that'll be a competitor though with the Falcon 9 rocket, not with the Starship.
Yep.
Which will be, I mean, great for like what's exciting to me about this is not just, the romanticism of going to space, but it's really the commercial aspect of it. So the profit margins that SpaceX takes on Falcon 9 rockets are pretty large because they have no competition.
Yep.
So if Blue Origin enters the scene with a competitive product, it'll really drive down prices even more. And that's already after Falcon 9 has driven it down by an order of magnitude or more. That is cost of mass to orbit. So that's when you get all the exciting, like the things that'll be exciting for us in terms of product, like orbital manufacturing is like zero G manufacturing is supposed to be some kind of like take our ability to make certain delicate machinery and pharmaceuticals to another level. So if we could bring that online in the next 10, 20 years, I mean, new drugs, new products for us. I'm not going to Mars in 20 years, whether or not SpaceX does. So
no.
I should say the other company that I'm excited about that gets less press is Rocket Labs.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things they're doing is, and this I didn't learn this until after I did the podcast for ARI a couple weeks ago. But in that podcast, I made the remark like, what can private there's a question, can private industry do scientific research, like the big ticket scientists or sending probes, to Pluto and putting up giant telescopes? Will private industry ever do that? And there's a kind of attitude amongst people who are commercial space skeptics, like, no, that's too expensive. You need a government to do it. And one is you can't think of it in current price tags because they're trying to get the cost to orbit just radically lower. And just so many things change if you do that. But the other is, I mean, who cares about a telescope? Like I do because I like science, but who's the actual cost? It's like universities. And the Harvard endowment is like $50 million or $50 billion. So they can pay SpaceX to send their telescopes or whatever. Okay. So I recently learned that Rocket Labs One of the things that they're one of their niches is the most affordable scientific probes, and they have MIT as a customer to send probes. So this is something that's actually happening. So I mean, just the whole industry getting the everything exciting about space is a mass cost of mass to orbit problem. Whether it's the feasibility of going to Mars, scientific research, manufacturing, space stations, tourism, it's all the same problem. And all of these, all these guys working on that, that's the kind of future, I want to live in. Where
Yeah.
I know you're a big fan of The Expanse. Is that? Do I remember?
I like the Expense Show a lot. Yeah, I thought
Yeah.
it was really good until was it the last
Oh,
season?
it gets weird. No, yeah.
Yeah. But the first two seasons, I mean, I like character-driven shows and science fiction. You can create environments in which you can really bring out characters and you can really put them in weird situations and explore that. And I think that's why science fiction is so attractive. It's less about projecting the future. It's more about putting people in these situations that are
So
interesting.
I liked it for the projection of the future. I mean, I like the characters too, but no, it's very carefully accurate, I think, to what could be possible.
Yeah, mining
And
asteroid belts and
yeah,
and a
just
human colony on Mars and all of that.
the commerce and people. Your job is you're essentially a trucker, but you're on a giant spaceship, like moving ice around.
Yeah.
That's a really neat, exciting future to me. And it had to get to there. You need to solve the mass to orbit problem, and that looks like what is currently on the verge of being solved.
Well, really, to get to there, what we need to solve is the mortality problem.
Well, yeah, to get to there personally, yeah. That's
I need to, I need to live long enough
only
to see
thing,
it.
only thing science fiction always is 500 years in the future, and there's elderly people. Like, it doesn't make any sense to me that was.
Yeah, things like that. I mean, I was thinking that the other day. I was watching a science fiction thing, and it was like, wait a minute, everything's expanded except healthcare, right? Everything's
Yeah,
better.
yeah, exactly, right, right.
Healthcare. They still get old. They still look exactly like us. What's up with that? And where are the chips in the brain, right? I mean,
Yeah, right,
where's
right.
the Neuralink? What happened to that? Um, this is tricky, I know, but what your evaluation of Musk?
Um, I mean, I kind of have a pet theory that you can understand. So one of the reasons a lot of people don't like Musk is that he seems erratic. And I actually don't think he is. I mean, certain things, like he's got a 15-year-old boy sense of humor and he plays video games, like that kind of thing. Okay, but my theory of him is that if you really take seriously the stuff he says about his purpose of like expanding consciousness to the cosmos, and he gave us a sort of soft endorsement to the long-termism philosophy a few
Yeah.
years ago.
Yeah.
I think pretty much everything he's doing, even the weird political things, becomes intelligible. That is why he's thinking this way, why he's doing these things. So yeah, I think that's a false philosophy. I think it can't, like, he has to be, however driven by that he is, he also has to be driven just by he likes making cool things, which is
Oh yeah, clearly.
that's the good motivation. The other stuff is garbage. So I don't really have a whole, like, what I care about is him at SpaceX, Neuralink, Tesla, and Boring Company.
Yep.
And that's really great. And if he turns out to be like Henry Ford, that's a tragedy. Henry Ford, for people who don't know, is just like, invented the assembly line and is a great industrialist and also crazy anti-Semite. Like, wrote like books and not just like had a personal opinion, but was like spewing it out and pushing it forward. If that's who he turns out to be, like, that's really tragic. But what I am interested in and what I admire is him combing over the wreckage of a failed Falcon 9, like from 20 years ago. Like, that's the guy that's interesting and worth thinking about. Now, the more he gets involved in politics, the more you can't just segment that off as just, oh, okay, he's weird and eclectic or eccentric in some other way. But even the politics, like I think if you just take him at his word that he really thinks Kamala Harris is an existential threat to his businesses, like if he really believes that, then what he's doing makes sense.
Yep.
Because he doesn't have some view about, the future of the culture. He has this view about, I want to get to Mars, and who's more likely to obstruct me, the Democrats or the Republicans? And that's I wish he was a deeper thinker outside of the manufacturing floor. But yeah, and like the more political he gets, the more you have to judge him on that.
Yeah, sadly. But the election will be over tomorrow, so at least this.
I mean, we'll have to have this conversation again in 6 months if Trump wins, because it seems like he'll be part of that machine.
Yeah, I hope for his sake he's not.
I hope
he stays away from it, because I think it'll kill him. I think he'll self-destruct in one way or the other.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Politics is not for him. Dealing with the bureaucracy of government is not for him. He'll break, or he'll break stuff, and it won't be pretty.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, let's jump to the questions. We've got, I think, a bunch of them. Wes says, I'm a big fan of this philosophy of science stuff. Keep it up. Thanks, Wes.
Me too. So.
Let's see, Liam says, this is interesting question. It says, Kant's philosophy typically leads to communism, fascism, but somehow many free market thinkers are under the spell of Kant, like Popper, Milton Friedman, Jordan Peterson. I don't know if Jordan Peterson is a free market guy, but no, but you can add even Mises, right? Even Mises was very influenced by Kant, certainly Hayek. You would think if they fell for Kant's epistemology, they wouldn't embrace Aristotelian economics. So I guess the question is, how do you get that?
Yeah, so Kant leading to what was the actual word, totalitarianism or
leads to communism, fascism.
I mean, yeah. There's a lot of intermediate steps you have to go. Like Kant himself is a sort of Enlightenment liberal.
Yeah, politically.
I think he was in favor of the American Revolution, if I remember correctly. So there's a lot of intermediate steps. And Kant himself didn't have like a whole elaborate political. He doesn't have a critique for the political theory. He just has for epistemology and morals. So there's a lot of intermediate steps. So that's one thing. For one of the possible paths you could take as a Kantian is towards more subjectivism and a kind of leave me alone, let me do my own thing type of libertarianism fits somewhat comfortably with that. So that's part of it. If you have particular people in mind, like a Mises, for him, I really think he had some original ideas in economics and was looking for a philosophical justification, and that's what he knew. And there were similar. What Mises is saying about economics is similar to what Kantians say about geometry. It's like an a priori foundation for doing science that is just kind of innate in you. And Mises's praxeology is this kind of foundational framework for doing social sciences that has a kind of deductive structure like a geometry. So that's probably influencing him as well. You have to be careful with
because he had an Aristotelian teacher. I mean, Menger is
Aristotelian, but it's Aristotelian in the limited sense that it doesn't have a really sophisticated epistemology to deal with this stuff, and it's also the Aristotelianism in Austria at the time is the name of the figure is escaping me, Brentano, I think. Franz Brentano is this Aristotelian, from what I know about him, some very good stuff. He's a Catholic priest.
Mhm.
So it's that kind of Aristotelianism. So it's not, it's not like, it's not even Aristotle Aristotelianism. It's this newfangled inferior Aristotelianism. So that's another factor. Um, but I think the most important one is just that there's a lot of intermediate steps even between Marx and Kant. Like especially Hegel
Yep.
is good intermediate. And if you think all that Hegel stuff is garbage, it doesn't make any sense. And you just go with Kant, then you maybe have some more free space to allow your contradictions to coexist.
It seems like almost every intellectual trend of the last 200 years is Kantian. So it goes, he has it influences everything.
Yeah, I mean it's in the good stuff and it's in the bad stuff. That's part of one. Uh, the my sense of the kind of libertarian, more market-oriented type people is that they're not the more philosophical, sophisticated ones are more Hume empiricism than they are Kant.
Yep. I think that's right.
There's tend to be skeptical, moderate skeptics, knowing skeptics is the way Dr.
Mhm.
Peacock puts it. Which is that's a different, the Hume trend is its own trend, and the closer you get to a philosophy department, the more likely the trend is Hume than it is Kant. Um, so
Philosophy department.
yeah, I think the two big figures in philosophy nowadays are Aristotle and Hume.
Okay.
I mean,
Interesting.
you still learn Kant, and they're still Kantians. I don't want to deny that, but those are the two. I don't know about economics and
And
political
would that
science.
be, would you consider a good thing?
The Aristotle trend certainly.
Yeah.
I mean, the Hume is a kind of just a form of skepticism. So the actual manifestation of it in people's views is uh, skepticism plus whatever influences by whatever the foil is at the time. So you get Humeans in philosophy of science, at least, who they don't think we don't know anything. And they just think scientific knowledge is about patterns and regularities, not about causes. Whereas the Aristotelians say, no, science is about causes, um, which is a kind of, better than Hume himself, but it's still Humean.
Um, Ali says, why do some religious individuals advocate for ideas of divine creation as the origin of life on Earth rather than focusing solely on traditional narratives like the story of Adam and Eve? They often adapt and reframe. So I
I
don't know
didn't,
if
yeah, I didn't follow that. Why isn't Adam and Eve a creation story? Is it?
it is, but why don't they just accept Adam and Eve creation story? Why do
Oh, okay. Why aren't they all young Earth creationists? Why are they like Discovery Science,
yeah.
this Discovery Institute,
Why
and
are they adapting? Why are they reframing?
well, so look, if so, part of it's going to be political. So if you want to get it into public schools and you're just nakedly saying, um, the Adam and Eve story gets taught as biology, uh, yeah, that's going to, of course, be opposed and struck down in the Supreme Court. But if you say, no, look, here's this alternate scientific theory called intelligent design, creation, or whatever they call it nowadays, then then there's a debate. Oh, is this science or not? And now there's wiggle room. Now there's you kind of think of it as like getting a lever in there to open the door. But if you're just straight up biblical myths, yeah. So that's my there's also a push to get more respectability in universities from now I think it's pretty much over or failed. But starting maybe 25 years ago, there was the Discovery Institute had fellows and they had people getting PhDs, sort of in a perverse way, like what objectivists sometimes think of, like, oh, we'll get people with PhDs and they'll get jobs and then they'll advocate objectivism, that kind of like, yeah, doing the same thing, but with creation science. And there's, but it's instead of philosophy, it's usually biology degrees or math degrees or something like that. So that's another part of it. But I think it's all just strategic. I don't think there's maybe if maybe a few people just want to be don't have a strategy behind it. They just want to be more respectable to their colleagues.
Mhm.
So Michael Beebe is I think that's how you say his name, the intelligent design theorist that was relied on a lot during the kind of court cases of 20 years ago. And he's a professor at a college in Pennsylvania, I think, who's a biology professor. And, that he can give a whole pseudo theory that's more respectable than just saying what the Bible says it. So.
Yeah. All right, let's see. Michael says the theory of relativity states that time is a physical part of the universe, somehow woven into the integration of space and matter. But according to objectivism, time is just a concept. So I don't know if you agree with that and how you would.
What's the question is who's right or?
Yeah. Or yeah.
Well, I mean, my understanding. So I'm not. I'm
I don't
not
know
a.
what just the concept means, but anyway.
Well, I mean, I say I'm not a physicist. So that's my qualification. You had Keith Lockett on a few months ago talking about some of this stuff. My understanding is that length contraction and time dilation are real physical measurable effects. So if that's the case, your understanding of the metaphysics of time needs to conform to that. There is no axiom of time. There's no metaphysical principle about time. What there is a kind of conversational comment Rand made about time being a measure of motion.
Mhm.
But that's not a theory of time. That's just what do you mean by what's on the hands of the clock? You're measuring motion. And if physicists want to build something more around that, maybe you could criticize them in the sense that, well, you're not really talking about time anymore. You're talking about something else.
Okay.
But no, I'm not ready to say there's an objectivist view on time. What there is one or two comments Rand made about the relationship between the concepts time and duration and motion. And I mean, and just to poke at the question a little bit, time is just a concept. I don't know what the questioner means by that. That makes me, if this were in class, I'd really want to ask you, what do you mean by that? And how do you understand what that means in objectivism? Because I don't think that just a concept that's not something I would say about much of anything. Yeah.
But anything. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, everything is a concept in a sense, right?
If it's a valid concept, then it's depends on what it's based on. Yeah.
Andrew says, Rand thought Aristotle had serious defects in his ethics. What is an example of a difference between them on ethics? And do their ethical differences flow from their epistemological differences?
Okay. So they have different views of virtue. I'll choose that as one of them. So for Aristotle, a virtue is a kind of disposition towards emotional states. To be courageous is to feel the right amount of courage and to be courageous is to feel the right amount of confidence and the right amount of fear and apprehension in the right situation. So it's more about like managing emotions that you feel in certain conditions for Aristotle, and for Rand, it's not. It's virtues are principles of action based on the needs of human life. So it's just a different conception of virtue. I was saying that there's interesting, good advice in Aristotle's theories of virtue, but that's a major difference. What was the second part of the question was it was what's the difference, and then there was something else.
Does that flow? Do the differences flow from the differences in epistemology?
Okay, I don't know Aristotle well enough to say
It
that
seems like it would, because if Rand's ethics in some ways flows from reason, from reason as man's means of survival, that's really not a concept in Aristotle, is it?
well.
Does his ethics flow from that?
Well, but so he has an argument that reason is the function of man.
Yeah.
And how do you understand that relative to, is that the same basic idea as reason as man's means of survival, but he has a different understanding of reason, and that's why there's difference? Like I've learned this from other objectivist, Aristotle scholars. My understanding is that most of the bad stuff in Aristotle comes out of his division of reason into the theoretical and the practical. Like that's part of the basis of the justification of slavery and things like that. So now, does that division come from his epistemology? Well, yeah, I guess so. In one sense, that's going to be the answer to that for any systematic philosopher is going to be yes. It's just the issue is I don't know Aristotle well enough to like spell out all the steps for you. Yeah.
That'd be a good question, Andrew, for Greg next time he's here. Let's see. Jay says, Mike, we need to talk. I agree with your assessment of Musk. And then he says, why Apollo? Space race with USSR. Why today's investments by government? Space race with China. The space station and the moon colony program.
Yeah, I both I partially agree, partially disagree. So my sense is that so one, to understand the current, like why is all of this happening now the way it's happening, all this SpaceX Blue Origin stuff, there's a line of deregulation going back to the Reagan administration that isn't actually come into so was enforced as a matter of law, but not as a matter of fact until the early 2000s. So there's the 84 or 82 Commercialization of Space Act, and then different agencies are given administration over this, and nothing much happens. It winds up being just only Boeing and Lockheed Martin can do anything, and then the only things they can do are things with NASA. And so then there's additional amendments to that, and then it's under really Bush that there's a real push for NASA needs to get out of the way. The FAA needs to allow more things to happen, and that's part of a broader trend in the defense industry of cooperating with allowing more players to compete, right? So it's not just Boeing and Lockheed Martin back and forth. So there's just a bigger thing going on there that's a deregulation trend that goes back into there's the commercialization of space thing starts first, and I think it's in the late 90s that the changes in the defense industry. One of the big differences that I can point out directly is how I forget the names of the two funding models, but it used to be, Boeing would get a contract with NASA, and then it would be, well, the money you get is however much it costs you to do this task we've set to you, plus like some your bonus.
Plus.
Yeah, plus, right. And that was how funding was, and like obviously that's going to be abused, and nothing's going to get done, and it's going to. But recently, like you compete for a contract and you get this much money to do the task, is what SpaceX and Blue Origin and all the others are getting. So I mean that just that alone would make NASA, even if none of the commercialization happened, would make NASA just more capable if that's what they were doing. The Space Launch System, the SLS rocket, if you read about that, is just a complete mess. It should just be scrapped. I mean, aside from my reasons for thinking NASA should be scrapped to begin with, it's just become unnecessary at this point, given what Blue Origin and SpaceX are doing.
The other aspect of this has to be that because of Silicon Valley, because of the boom in Silicon Valley, suddenly capital was created and put it in a sense and created by people who had it, who, like you, grew up on science fiction and had,
that's certainly part of the story, but if it's illegal to launch your own rockets, that doesn't matter.
Yes, no question. But part of the pressure in the 1980s and the Reagan administration and late 80s and the Bush
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
was from people who now believed that they could do this stuff, and many of those were entrepreneurs, and much of that came from kind of the tech industry.
There's an interesting book I just started reading, Unit X.
I started reading it today.
Oh,
Wait,
you
I
I
literally
okay.
started reading it.
Okay. Yeah, good, good.
I'm
But
listening to it on audio. I'm
oh,
really
okay. Yeah.
enjoying it. Really
Yeah,
enjoying it.
it's about this I don't know what you call it, group or division of the Pentagon that
Yeah.
its mission is to get tech, like Silicon Valley tech, more involved in, and they talk about the Andreal and
I
what's the
haven't got to that point. I'm still.
Palantir, and all the people doing interesting things, mostly in aerospace and computers. But yeah, no, it was to really push the commercialization of all of this. And part of what's different now too is that the people getting the groups getting or the companies getting NASA contracts, they have much more ownership over what they develop. So like, okay, develop the space shuttle. You don't get to go make your own space shuttles and launch them. You make it for NASA, and NASA owns the thing. But the Starship human HLS lander that SpaceX is building for NASA, like that, SpaceX can just go make their own too. So so there's a lot of things that are much better, even within the context of there shouldn't be a NASA to begin with.
All right, let's see. Liam says, will Elon Musk land the first human on Mars by the end of the decade?
Maybe.
Maybe. All right, that's a good answer.
I mean, like each success of Starship
End of the
will
decade.
make it more nice, or will make it more likely. So, I mean, if this summer, if they hit the target and they can successfully demonstrate orbital refueling, I mean, my answer to that will be a much more likely than if it fails and they have to try again a couple months later, then I'd say, I don't know, maybe it'll be, another whatever. But yeah, the big ones are going to, I mean, the orbital refueling is probably the biggest one, because the way Starship is designed, it can't get to Mars or the moon unless it refuels in orbit. So they have to be able to do that. And if
Yep.
they can't do it, they're really the only game in town right now.
Yep.
We'll see what happens with New Glenn and what Blue Origin is working on. But yeah, that'll be the big one. I think is the even more so than catching the Starship itself, I think.
Mm-hmm. Justin asks, George Soros became a great investor by following Popper's philosophy. Is that a proof of its power?
I don't know anything about George Soros investing philosophy. Your own, that's more like,
Yeah, I don't see him following Popper. I mean, he's just a great investor. And he was a great investor. I don't know, and I don't think that was guided by Popper's philosophy.
yeah.
I think
Your own, are there philosophies that you can follow to become a better investor? Doesn't that just strikes me as funny? Just anyone who's making that kind of claim, it strikes me as a little suspicious. I
well, I mean,
follow
you have to connect it to reality. You have to,
okay.
you have to be data oriented. You have to build, you have to cause and effect. I mean, at the big picture, yeah. I mean, you have to be guided by some ideas, otherwise you're not going to
Or if
succeed.
you're looking at star charts or something, that's not
Yeah,
gonna,
but is there a no? I mean, philosophy doesn't translate into there's no objectivist way of investing versus another way. There's good investing and bad investing, just like there's good medicine, bad medicine. It's not objectivist medicine
yeah.
because it's good. So it's all right. Larry says, as a biologist whose career focused on producing a better mink coat, I applaud the scope of your discourse.
Okay.
Thanks, Larry. I appreciate that. I don't know what producing a better mink coat looks like.
One of the things that I think is bad about the influence of Popper on practicing scientists is that there's real positive advice good epistemology could give them, could give practicing scientists. And if you're just in the mindset of thinking, well, all science is testing and rooting out errors. I mean, that's true. You have to do tests and compare theories. There's nothing wrong with any of that, but there's just a whole lot of other advice that could be given and that would make research better, I think. that just doesn't get talked about or thought about if you're coming from the Popper perspective.
Yes, and I wonder how many of them are consistent about that. I mean, how many of them engage in induction? I mean, they have to engage in induction, but how many of them consciously do it? How many of them suppress that and pretend it's not induction in order to justify it? I mean, it's interesting just how it plays out in terms of particularly fun, the real scientists, the people who are doing new science. It would be interesting.
Popper has a chart that he puts in a number of his essays, so indicating it's really important to him. And on the left-hand side of the chart is concept stuff, meaning, definition, like that. And on the right-hand side of the chart is proposition stuff, so sentences, truth, test, verification, like that's on there. And he says the left-hand side of the chart, that doesn't matter that much. It's all on the right-hand side of the chart.
All the proposition.
And if especially in cutting edge sort of basic science, if you learn a little bit of the histories of like the early electromagnetism, it's all about forming the right concepts, finding the right definitions, and the good, the good Ampere and the good early electromagnetic theory. They're all very they have guiding principles that they're trying to follow in developing what experiments will help me figure out what the best definition is, and that kind of thing. And all of that kind of gets lost. I'm not that anybody in some other competing Bayesian or anti-Popperian has anything better to say, but just if you're in the Popper world, like none of that is interesting to you, and that's where all the great advice is how to make the right new concepts and how to define them, and then you can start doing your tests. Now I've got a vocabulary, and there's principles to follow to come up with the right vocabulary.
Yeah, Brett, who is a student of Deutsch's, says, Popper never said science is just about testing. It's about explanations, accounts of what exists, how it behaves, and why.
Is that Deutsch or is that Popper?
He's saying it's Popper. It sounds like Deutsch.
I mean, yeah, Popper thinks there are explanations. It's just that how do you know which explanation to accept? You have to test. It's all about testing. I mean, there's nothing else you could do if you don't think there are principles of forming the right definition, and if you don't think there are principles of when evidence supports a conclusion or confirms it even.
We should get you on Brett's podcast.
I don't know Brett. Who's
Brett Hall? You should follow Brett Hall. He's a smart guy.
I'll look him up on Twitter.
Yeah, he likes Ayn Rand.
Okay.
He follows me. We're going to do something in Australia. He's in Australia. We're going to do something in Australia together. He's a good guy, and he's close to Deutsch. And I think you guys should talk directly rather than through my chat. I think it'll be interesting.
Yeah.
All right. I don't know if Brett is open to this, but I just scheduled a guest for you on your show, Brett. All right. Clay says, thanks for the stimulating conversation. Thanks for the support, Clay. Really appreciate it. Justin, is Popper's method perfect for debunking conspiracies?
I mean, I don't think so. So let me draw the contrast between how would an objectivist versus a Popperian debunk a conspiracy theory? Well, you'd look at the theory and you'd say, is there any positive evidence in favor of this theory? And if not, you'd say, okay, that's it. So that's my objectivist debunk, right? So there's no positive evidence in favor. The Popperian would say, okay, well, what testable predictions does the theory make? And you have to make them like there are rules about or principles about this. It has to be precise enough to actually test and measure and get results. And if the predictions don't come true, then the theory is falsified. But if it doesn't matter where the theory comes from, can't I just modify the theory just enough so that it makes a different prediction and it remains unfalsified? And then, okay, well, there's a new theory and we have to go through the whole thing again. And it comes out falsified. And then and this is like what conspiracy theorists actually do. They'll, something will happen that looks like it contradicts their theory, and then they'll modify it. They'll create some new conspirator. They'll create some new layer of deception. And it keeps going on and on like that. So I think that's just the position you're in if you don't think positive evidence matters or is possible, that there's just always some new twist on whatever's been debunked. I mean, this is a kind of, it's not like the Popperians don't know this is a problem. There's a issue in hypothesis testing of what do you do about your auxiliary assumptions when you do a test? So if you, Popper's favorite example is the test between the Newtonian and Einsteinian prediction about the path of light around a solar eclipse. And they go and they do the observations, and it seems to check the Einstein side and refute the Newton side. But then you say, well, I mean, couldn't the sun have heated up the mirror, and that was why the different and then maybe the mirror was warped to begin with, or maybe somebody recorded the information. You have all these auxiliary assumptions you're making whenever you do a test. And how do you know that the contradictions, the hypothesis you're testing, and not in some kind of auxiliary assumption you're making? So, and the reason that comes up as a puzzle, because all of those assumptions are only acceptable if they themselves have passed a test, a kind of falsificationist test. So yeah, I mean, the Popperians have things to say about that. I don't find them persuasive, obviously. My charge is that, yeah, this just will go on and on and on. This is an invitation to arbitrary speculation, not an answer to it.
Ali says, how can we address theories like string theory, which have remained without experimental proof and have potentially stalled progress in physics over the past 40 years?
Well, the question presupposes that string theory is a non-starter and has stalled physics over the last 40 years. And that's kind of my impression, but I'm not willing to commit to that with any certainty. I mean, I'm a moderate string theory skeptic. There's no principle that says that won't happen with completely rational theorizing. So what if you reach the point where you just can't probe the deep structure of the universe without enormous amount of energies anymore? Like, think about the particle accelerators we use now. They have to, they have to be several kilometers around, and they take enormous amounts of energy, and they only produce so much energy, so many giga electron volts, whatever. What if to get to the next layer deep, you have to probe with a particle accelerator that needs to be 100 or 1,000 times larger? I mean, you might get to a point where, yeah, it's going to be hard. What are you going to do? You need to have experiments, but the experiments are so energy intensive that you can't do them. So maybe you're just stuck. Now, I don't think there's reason to think that that's where we are now, from what I understand of particle physics, which isn't much. But that itself doesn't prove anything that you can't do the experiments anymore.
Is there something philosophically corrupt about string theory?
Maybe. I mean, so some like Sabrina Hasenfelder has that book Lost in Math that makes the accusation that essentially, more my words, that string theorists are just extreme rationalists, and all of this mathematical all the mathematical tools they've created is just baseless speculation. I mean, it might be perfectly fine as mathematics, but it doesn't have anything to physics. I think you'd need to actually be,
you need to know something
pretty in this to know that that's true. Like, I've read some of her book and I've heard her talk about it, and I've read the Lee Smolin book and the Not Even Wrong book, and it's like, well, if I take them on face value, then it seems like there's a problem here in the physics. But it's not like people doing string theory don't have anything to say in response. And it gets to the point where it's like, I don't know. I don't know what the state of the evidence is, and I don't have a view of when does mathematical speculation become not good physics and become rationalism.
All right. Enric asks, does Popper's falsification theory relate or influence each other to the quantum theories of the uncertainty principle, probability, superpositioning, and such?
Popper is after, just in time. Popper is, yeah. So that stuff is 20s and 30s. Popper's first major work is The Logic of Scientific Discovery, which was published in German in the 30s, I think.
Okay.
So yeah, that's
He already
before.
knows that stuff.
Yeah. So if it's anything, it's the other way around. Yeah.
Andrew says, where does Popper stand on individualism metaphysically? Does he believe the individual exists?
Yes. This is something we didn't talk about. He has strange views about, so he thinks there's three realities or three worlds. There's the physical world, there's a kind of subjective human world of experience, and then there's so I mean that part is, I don't mean it to make it sound too Platonist, right? So he thinks there's the physical world, and there's your own subjective experience, your own first person experience. But he also thinks there's something called, he calls the third world sometimes, which is he calls it the world of objective knowledge. So it's his example is the example that I think is most intelligible. If you think of like the counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. Once you create that system, they like have a life of their own. So you might not know anything about prime numbers or evens or odds, but there's all these truths about the number system and primes and factors and blah, 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 that you commit yourself to just by creating the number system. Does that make sense so far? And
Yeah.
I think that is not any individual person's subjective anything. It exists, it's real. And it's a human creation, but it's not a subjective human creation. He refers to like a spider web. Like a spider web is created by a spider, but once it's there, it's its own independent being. And you can talk about why did the spider do this, but you can also ask what are the structures of the web, and the structures of the web have nothing to do with the spider that made it once it's made. And so there's this whole third object, but that's like not exactly an individual creation; it's a social creation. These human artifacts that are objective knowledge, and that to me is a little collectivisty. And it's hard to know what to say about that. Does that in some way, because you're a metaphysical individual, but you participate in this objective, intrinsicist third world, and that's where knowledge comes from, scientific knowledge comes from. So is that a way in which there's some metaphysical jointedness between people? Maybe. I mean, I think of him more as, when it comes to individualism versus collectivism, he's an individualist, and anything that pushes against that is despite his intentions.
Megan asks, what is the worst example of bad scientific epistemology in industry that you know of?
In industry,
Catherine Holmes? I don't know if that's bad.
is that Theranos? Is it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's just outright. Yeah, that's outright fraud. Yeah, yeah, it's hard to answer, because the one thing that's good about falsificationism is if you just followed that, if you actually lived up to it, I don't think it would be unlikely that you'd arrive at a position where you're like, your business is wedded to a thesis that's just completely contradicts reality at every turn. Because you'd be doing all these falsificationist attempts and it would fall out. And I mean, if you put it in terms of industry, it's hard to maintain a theory and that's false and survive.
For very long.
Yeah, you just lose money and go out of business and we wouldn't know about you. Yeah, so I don't know how to really answer that question any better than say, I don't know. And I don't think anybody would know if people tried to implement false theories at any scale. Yeah.
So Justin, this is completely unrelated. Okay, Justin says, why did the manosphere become anti-Semitic?
Oh, okay. So for anybody who doesn't know, I wrote an article in the Manosphere in the spring. I mean, because it's tribal. So it's always been like if anybody in your I don't know you're did you ever watch Married with Children? Al
Yeah,
Bundy.
I watched a few episodes. I hated that show. I mean, it was the show I hated the most.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what the reason I'm bringing it up is there was a kind of like men's rights thing as a running gag.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that's what the manosphere is. It's dressed up in Evo Psych and everything, but it's like a tribalist thing of resentful men who um, either have no ability to succeed with women and therefore resent them, or used to have no ability and now they've acquired it but are still resentful. So why did they become anti-Semitic? Just because they're tribal and their whole reason for organizing as a movement is their resentment of the other sex. And then the other sex they identify with feminist values, and that's kind of left-wingy. So then this movement that thinks of itself as, no, we're just trying to help men meet women. Why would it be political at all? But pretty quickly it descends into, a culture war thing because it's a tribal movement and they've defined themselves as opposed to a certain kind of woman. And that kind of woman is a kind of sort of left-wingy feminist thing. And the more you just like chase that, chase that way of thinking, well, then it sort of becomes like, well, yeah, and it's kind of white too. It's kind of like white rights and great replacement theory. And then what's next there is a kind of anti-Semitism. So that's my like hypothesis about why. But in fairness, I don't think that's uniform. I think it's more like there's a lot of those types within it, and they're tolerant of that. Yeah, there's also an issue if you don't have any membership qualification other than your a guy saying the right things about the right tribes, like
Yep.
you're going to get those people in and they're going to be loud and they're going to be, they'll ruin it. So there's that going on too.
I don't know if you want to answer this, but Justin asks, are you voting for Trump or Harris?
I can answer as an individual, not a representative of my employer. I'm going to vote for Harris. Yeah. I had a moment where I wasn't going to vote, but my only reservation is if Trump loses, I'm not convinced there won't be retaliation against Musk.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's already been political targeting of him before he even got involved politically. So that was my reservation, but
the choices are so awful.
Yeah.
Justin, also thoughts on hypergamy?
I assume it's asking about it as it is used in the manosphere and not how it's actually used in social science. So in social science, it's just this. It's not even a theory. It's more like an observation that women slightly more than men tend to like marry or mate up in the like status. So you're more likely to see, the rich man with a girl from the slums than the other way around, like that idea. Yeah, Pretty Woman, the movie. Yeah. So, so in the social sciences, my understanding is that's just an empirical observation about human societies, that's how people shake out whether or not they have control over their partner or
I
not.
assume evolutionary psychology has a whole theory to explain that and to say that it's true, or don't they?
Um, I've read a few hypotheses. The one that the manosphere picks up on is the idea that there's women have a sort of tendency to uh, sleep up, and it's like a reproductive strategy that they got from evolutionary psychology. But even the people who had that theory to begin with think it just didn't pan out. This is not true. Um, this is in my article. I don't really have anything to say more than what was in my article, and it's not like fresh in my mind. I haven't thought about it since last March.
Justin must have
You know,
read the article before
I
you.
don't think it's a real thing in any of the like in any of the interesting or let's say consequential ways that the manosphere thinks it is. I think it's just like, yeah, there's a slight, and it's like really slight bias for women to pair up and then there's a question of what does it even up mean? Does it even mean anything? Like, though it's related to the whole uh alpha male, beta male thing, that it's just internally like nonsensical.
Yeah.
Like, if you think about like what would if alpha male is supposed to be the most capable of surviving and reproducing, like what does that look like in modern society? Like,
Yeah. It doesn't look the same as it did 1,000
yeah,
years ago.
Elon Musk has $100 billion and like 12 kids, but like you look at him and he's like this geeky guy. It's not their picture of an alpha, right? So yeah, like I said, read the Manosphere article. I kind of that was a one and done for me. I don't particularly have any interest in talking about these people anymore.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting question that one of our psychologists will have to deal with at some point about masculinity, femininity, and what they mean,
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm sure
how
there's
they
a
manifest itself, and how they manifest themselves today versus 1,000 years ago, and what does that mean? And it's a fascinating topic, and it's interesting, but we need a psychologist. I mean, a
yeah,
good
yeah.
one to do that work. It's not for dabbling. All right, Hugh asks, great show. Your talk on Frege's logic was very enlightening.
Thank
How
you.
would you sell objectivist epistemology over Popperian to a scientist or an engineer?
Well, so one is, I think the selling point for any epistemology excuse me, a practicing scientist, especially an engineer, is going to be, here's how it's actually going to make your work better, right? It's not just about defending, science from skeptics or religious. It's something like, here's the equivalent of like a methodology class. Like, here's how to do science, and here's some things you're not doing that if you did, you'd be a better, a better researcher. So the first step would be to just like spell that all out, which I don't think anybody's done yet. So like if I were to teach a philosophy of science class that was just like, here's the epistemology of science, I don't even know what I would assign. Some of the logical leap is good, and some of it I don't think it's either not good or not on this question. So like parts of that, parts of OPAR, like there's not a self-contained thing that's really, no one's really talked about the epistemology of experiment
Yep.
or explanations.
The new work needs to be done here.
Yeah.
All right. Andrew says, does skepticism of percepts typically precede skepticism of higher knowledge?
Yes, if by percepts you really mean percepts, like the way objectivism thinks about perception. You see the whole world in front of you, objects arranged in space and time. I mentioned earlier, there are, like, if you ask David Hume, who's the arch skeptic, Is perception fallible? I think he would probably say yes, but if you asked him if like sensation was fallible, he'd probably say that's not even a coherent, quite like sensation is like an atomic sensation, like red at this moment. What would it mean to be fallible? I don't think that would be coherent for him, but he's still a skeptic because you can't put all that together into a story of the world. You can't put sense atoms together into a true picture of the world. So I would say it's certainly a precondition for skepticism. Like if you think sense perception gives you automatic and infallible information about reality, well, already you've departed from skepticism. So. I would say the most skeptical arguments, like if you take a class on skepticism, some of them will talk about perception, but some of them won't say anything about perception. So you can give a skeptical argument that doesn't immediately, in terms of like what are the premises of this argument, doesn't immediately depend on it.
Michael asks, whether someone advocates chipping away at certainty or undercutting your mind's ability to induce, are they evil? I guess, are they evading?
Are they evil? Or are they evade? Like those aren't the same. Those aren't the same questions. So
yeah, are they evil?
I think there is. I wouldn't say like if you really mean evil, like Jim Taggart and Robert Stadler and Floyd Ferris, and and Mao and Kant are evil. Then I would say no, not it doesn't necessarily make you like that. Does it make you intellectually dishonest and ill-motivated? I would say yeah. Like you can't have a philosophy that's, oh, I'm in favor of reason and reality, and I'm also going to undercut your confidence in your ability to reason your way to reality. I don't think that's an honest position. Now, where exactly is the dishonesty? If you want to like talk about which arguments could you hold honestly versus not, that's a different question. But
all right, James asked, I suspect converting Elon Musk to objectivism wouldn't be that hard. You'd be surprised, James. Blake Charles will eventually team up with Elon after Elon witnesses the success of BOOM Airlines. Well, maybe.
I think those two are in a certain respect competitors, because one of the uses of Starship is like point-to-point transportation on the Earth.
Yeah.
Which is way faster than Blake's airplanes.
Yep.
Hyperloop, if that ever actually happened, well, would probably be a compare. So I don't know, maybe there's no supersonic air travel on Mars. So I don't see what the connection between those two is, but I think the hard part would be getting him to listen to you long enough to explain objectivism.
I mean, he's read Rand, and she didn't convince him. So
well, he's read Atlas Shrugged. That's
Yep.
true. And I don't know when he's read it, and I don't know in what, did he listen to the audiobook? Did he read the Cliff Notes? Did he skip over the speeches? Like, I don't know. When somebody says they've read Atlas Shrugged, I'm never exactly sure what that means until they tell me in any detail.
Yep.
Or even if it's true.
Yep. And like, I just think converting people to objectivism is hard.
Yeah.
Even when they're geniuses, even when they're extraordinary people.
Well, part of being brilliant is being brilliantly able to come up with objections and rationalizations, and so it can be even more difficult. I mean, even I said it, forget about rationalizations, just honest objections. They can go on and on and on way longer than most other people. So yeah, it'd be very difficult.
Justin, thoughts on RFK Jr.'s view of science?
Well, I've never heard him talk about science as a whole. I've only heard him talk about, environmentalism and vaccines, and is the latest one he's gonna fluoride. Yeah, that's what I saw. Fluoride in the water. Yeah. So in the few times I've looked into anything he's saying, it's like the best you could say. Well, there's one study that sort of seems to support his whatever he's saying, and then there's like a mountain of reasons why that doesn't, So no, I don't have any positive view of him, and everything I know is very negative. Like he's a charlatan. think.
Enric says, why aren't proponents and work for space? God, there must be typos there. But anyway, and work for space more on space stations like the O'Neill cylinder, with space stations out of asteroids that are much more feasible than colonizing Mars. Maybe you
Yeah,
understand.
that's a good. So I know what he's talking about. So the O'Neill cylinder is like this giant megastructure that you would live on the inside of the cylinder as it rotates and provides gravity. One of the difficulties with like using a spin to make gravity is that the greater the difference in the velocity of your head to your feet, the more nauseous you are. So like you couldn't have the inside of Starship like spinning. You'd have to have, because your head and your head would be going slow because it's near the center, and your feet would be going really fast. So you need these giant like distances to spin
Yeah.
to get spin gravity. So a O'Neill cylinder is this like giant cylinder in space that has an atmosphere inside it. You just build this megastructure and live on the surface of the cylinder, and it would, you see, if you've seen Interstellar, the movie, at the end of Interstellar, when it shows, spoiler alert, it shows the kind of farther future. They're inside an O'Neill cylinder, I think. So why not do that so one is Mars is already a surface with, some gravity. So you'd have to do, if you're going to do either of these things, you'd have to, weigh your costs and benefits to see it. Yeah, but that's a good question to me. Like, if you could actually make a giant colony on Mars, you could probably do the O'Neill cylinder too. And why would Mars be better than? And you could just make your own O'Neill cylinder. So you want to have gulch in space. You don't need to go to Mars. You just make your own thing. No, I think the things that'll be clearly economically feasible in the future are like asteroid mining, things like that. If you're thinking about like sending people out, and then even then you have to wonder, do we need to send out people? We can just send out machines. Yeah. I mean, unless there's some, find something on the surface of Mars that's really valuable, then you have additional reason to be there. So.
Larry says, does Popper subscribe to Plato's world of forms?
No.
So his third world is not anything.
Third world is not. You have to think it is a little spooky because it's spooky because it's not. I have a hard time taking it seriously but it's not the world of forms. It's created by human beings. It's just that once it's created, it has like, you can kind of, like I said, the counting numbers just to kind of help get your head around it. Like, there are truths about the number system that nobody knows right now. And the fact that the square root of 2 is irrational was a big surprise to the early mathematicians. And that's a deductive consequence of, if you want to think of it a little bit like chess, like it's a consequence of the rules of the system you've set up. And you might not see all the consequences of that. And now Popper thinks that means it has it's a life of it. He wants to call it the third world and has a life of its own. He talks about this in his essay, the Epistemology Without a Knowing Subject, which we're reading for my class. And there's truths about it that aren't up to you or me versus subjective truths, which are different. But it's not Platonism. It has some precedence in the history of philosophy, but it's not like, it doesn't predate man or something, it's not like part of the architecture of reality that ordered matter like Plato's forms are. It's its own thing.
All right, Ali has, how do you respond to people who say Rand was influenced by Nietzsche?
Rand was influenced by
Nietzsche.
Oh, Nietzsche. So there's some sense in which that's sort of true, which is that she read Nietzsche and she liked him at certain stages of her development, and so it depends on what they mean by influence. Like, if they mean she's just giving you warmed over Nietzsche, that's not true. Nietzsche's more of a he's kind of an irrationalist. He's not big, he doesn't think reason plays the central role in life that Rand does. He's uh, his concerns are different than her, like his moral concerns are different than hers. He's opposed to altruism, but the positive vision of life is not the life of productive achievement and money making. I
Yep.
think he actually is, I'm pretty sure he's contemptuous of capitalist activities.
Yes.
Yeah, so yeah, there's a great essay on this in the companion to Ayn Rand, and I'm blanking on the author who wrote it, but it's just on Rand and Nietzsche. That's worth looking at.
All right, we got 4 last questions. All right, Justin. Justin's coming up with questions from all over the place. Thoughts on race realism? Is it scientific?
No, it's not. If it's what I think you're talking about, race isn't really a biological category in the way that species is a biological category, or clade, all the the tree of life things. My understanding of race realism is just what it is the attempt to use dubious crime statistics to show that Black people are bad.
Yep.
And that you're denying reality if you, like, that's what they say, you're denying reality if you don't accept these conclusions from these statistics. Sometimes they talk about race and IQ.
Yep.
I mean, even if those statistics were true, nothing really would follow from them. So, see, I don't have like a whole theory about race realism and why people are race realists, other than they don't want to just be racist anymore. It's too.
Yeah, it's a way to rationalize their racism. It's a way to
It's a way to say that they're not a racist when they're a racist. Yeah.
like creationism. It's like this. It's
Yeah.
just
Good. Yeah. Yep. Yep. That's right.
trying to. All right. I don't know who these people are. He says thoughts on H. Spencer, S.K. Langer, and M. McLuhan.
Uh,
Yep. I don't know who they are.
Are they philosophers? Are they manosphere people? Are they
Don't know.
rocket scientists? We talked about a number of things they could be.
Rob, if you want to clarify, go ahead. But I have no idea who those people are.
Wait, did he say H. Spencer?
Yes.
Oh,
H.
Herbert Spencer?
Maybe it's Herbert Spencer.
Jeez, I read a little Herbert Spencer in high school. And I
Okay.
think
He says Herbert Spencer, Suzanne Langer, and Marshall McLuhan.
Suzanne Langer sounds like a familiar name, but I can't place it. And the third one,
Marshall McLuhan also sounds familiar, but I can't place it either.
yeah. And a lot of times, like, I know names because I read them and I never hear them spoken out loud. So maybe if I saw it on a paper, I'd recognize it. But no, I know who Herbert Spencer is, and Leonard Peikoff talks about him in the Ominous Parallels. But I never really I never found it interesting enough to follow up on.
Yep. Social Darwinism.
Hmm.
Jay, regarding the number system, a tool created for purpose, having been Swanger has an elegant distinction between as measured versus as calculated. Lots here for applied math. Sounds right.
Yeah.
Finally, Supercask has a statement. Manosphere are just male chauvinists that hate the modern woman for her liberty, confidence, and willingness to succeed. I think that's pretty accurate.
I don't have any strong disagreement with that.
No, neither do I. All right, this was fun. This was fun. Thanks.
Yaron, I had a good time.
Yeah, good. Thanks, guys. Lots of questions, good questions, and we raised good money. That's always good. And yeah, I'll see you guys. Actually, I don't know when I'll see you. We'll see. I'm flying tomorrow, so I will let you know when the next show is. I'll see you around sometime soon, I'm sure. And yeah, everybody have a good week. It's going to be hard to have a good week because it is election day tomorrow. So it's going to be a mess. It's probably going to be a mess the whole week. But, find something to enjoy in spite of all that. All right, everybody. Bye.